The Cuban Missile Crisis, also known as the October Crisis in Cuba or the Caribbean Crisis, was a 13-day confrontation between the governments of the United States and the Soviet Union, when American deployments of nuclear missiles in the United Kingdom, Italy, and Turkey were matched by Soviet deployments of nuclear missiles in Cuba. The crisis lasted from 16 to October 28, 1962. The confrontation is widely considered the closest the Cold War came to escalating into full-scale nuclear war. Beginning in 1959, the U.S. government deployed Thor nuclear missiles in England through an initiative known as Project Emily. In 1961, the U.S. put Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey. All were within range of Moscow. The U.S. had trained a paramilitary force of Cuban expatriates, which the CIA led in an attempt to invade Cuba and overthrow its government. Starting in November of that year, the U.S. government engaged in a violent campaign of terrorism and sabotage in Cuba, referred to as the Cuban Project, which continued throughout the first half of the 1960s. The Soviet administration was concerned about a Cuban drift towards China, with which the Soviets had an increasingly fractious relationship. In response to these factors, the Soviet and Cuban governments agreed, at a meeting between leaders Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro in July 1962, to place nuclear missiles on Cuba to deter a future U.S. invasion. Construction of launch facilities started shortly thereafter. A U-2 spy plane captured photographic evidence of medium and long-range launch facilities in October. U.S. President John F. Kennedy convened a meeting of the National Security Council and other key advisors, forming the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM. Kennedy was advised to carry out an air strike on Cuban soil in order to compromise Soviet missile supplies, followed by an invasion of the Cuban mainland. He chose a less aggressive course in order to avoid a declaration of war. On October 22nd, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to prevent further missiles from reaching Cuba. He referred to the blockade as a quarantine, not as a blockade, so the U.S. could avoid the formal implications of a state of war. An agreement was eventually reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba, subject to United Nations verification, in exchange for a U.S. public declaration and agreement not to invade Cuba again. The United States secretly agreed to dismantle all of the offensive weapons it had deployed to Turkey. All Thors in the UK were disbanded by August 1963. While the Soviets dismantled their missiles, some Soviet bombers remained in Cuba, and the United States kept the naval quarantine in place until November 20, 1962. The blockade was formally ended on November 20th after all offensive missiles and bombers had been withdrawn from Cuba. The evident necessity of a quick and direct communication line between the two powers resulted in the Moscow-Washington hotline. A series of agreements later reduced U.S.-Soviet tensions for several years. The compromise embarrassed Khrushchev and the Soviet Union because the withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Italy and Turkey was a secret deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the Soviets were seen as retreating from a situation that they had started. Khrushchev's fall from power 2 years later was in part because of the Soviet Politburo's embarrassment at both Khrushchev's eventual concessions to the U.S. and his ineptitude in precipitating the crisis. According to the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrinin, the top Soviet leadership took the Cuban outcome as a blow to its prestige bordering on humiliation.